Hello everyone, and welcome to this panel. And thank you for staying around after what was a very long film. My name is Siobhan Brennan, and I am chairing the panel tonight. I'm a student from the University of Warwick. I'm studying a Masters in English Literature, studying Shakespeare and Performance, and I'm currently directing a production of All's Well That Ends Well. I've been asked by Rebecca Gould to curate a series of talks to mark the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death, and I am joined by Dr Paul Prescott from the University of Warwick, who is an academic and a lecturer who is curating, let me find my notes, who is curating the Global Shakespeare degree, he's the convener of the Global Shakespeare degree at Warwick, and he has adapted The Taming of the Shrew and Richard III for the Montana Shakespeare Company, so his input will be very relevant tonight to our panel about adaptations and translations. I'm also joined by Gwyneth Lewis. Dr. Gwyneth Lewis as well. There we go. Who is the inaugural National Poet of Wales and who recently, a few years ago, translated The Tempest into Welsh as well. So thank you very much for coming, both of you. So our panel tonight is about adaptations and translations of Shakespeare, following our screening of Akira Kurosawa's Ram, which is based on King Lear, of course, and also a Japanese legend of Morikawa. So just to kick us off, Paul, could you talk a little bit about how Kurosawa's film, which we've just seen, is similar and differs from Shakespeare's King Lear?
Yeah, I think so. I know Shakespeare's King Lear slightly better than I know the legend of Morikawa.
Yeah.
Just to warn you, just a heads up on the cultural front. Yeah, it's very interesting when you see the opening credits to this film that there's one name that's conspicuous by its absence, and that's William Shakespeare. So often adaptations and films will actually front load the fact that Shakespeare has been somehow inspired this script. Kurosawa's film doesn't. Shakespeare isn't mentioned in the title credits, and that's fascinating to me, because the film both is and isn't King Lear, as those of you who saw it will have noticed. It is King Lear in the sense that it's about an aging patriarch who, apparently on a whim, decides to divide his kingdom. That's how Shakespeare's King Lear starts. But the change here, of course, is that Kurosawa casts 3 sons rather than 3 daughters. Kurosawa said he couldn't imagine in Japan in the 17th century that 3 daughters might be entrusted with ruling a kingdom. So automatically that decision brings with it a host of different repercussions in terms of the adaptation. What's really interesting watching it tonight is that Shakespeare comes in and out of focus in some of the lines, in some of the imagery, in the plot. But what also struck me tonight was how closely Kurosawa stays to the certain strand of Shakespeare's storytelling. The fool is a very important part in King Lear. Famously in King Lear, the fool vanishes about halfway through the action, inexplicably. Kurosawa makes an interesting decision to keep him right until the end, and indeed the fool weeps over Lear's dead body in this version. But there were so many other echoes of Lear that it's like watching, come in and out of focus. And I found it a fantastic film in its own right. You wouldn't need to know King Lear. You wouldn't need to have read a word of Shakespeare to find this a very profound and beautiful and troubling film. It just feels slightly different if you've come to it through Shakespeare, which I guess most of us have.
So, on that note, Gwyneth, so you translated The Tempest into Welsh quite recently. What would you say are the challenges of translating or adapting a Shakespeare play?
Well, it all depends what you choose to translate, because obviously Kurosawa's just picked the elements that he finds interesting. And actually, if you look at Lear, Shakespeare got the story from Geoffrey of Monmouth through Holinshed. And if you, from an original Welsh story, which has one source in the Mabinogion, I believe, and then another source in the Welsh Triads, so it's a hybrid story anyway, through many hands. So in that sense, Kurosawa was perfectly faithful to how Shakespeare was working, was putting elements that interested him together. But you know, when I was translating The Tempest from English into Welsh. So I decided that I would translate the metaphors and the meter. You know, but that it was possible to keep the 5-beat line in Welsh by certain adaptations. But in this, what's being translated isn't so much line by line, because these characters don't appear to be speaking in poetry, for a start, because Shakespeare is a poetic drama. But I was fascinated to listen to the soundtracks. I mean, for example, at the beginning, the cuckoo was a theme you could hear. And, you know, that's a metaphorical sound effect, because you're talking about cuckoos in the nest. Even if they don't mean that in Japan, they do mean that to us. And even though, if you listen to the soundtrack, which was wonderful, it was almost like, you know, you had natural sounds punctuating the action throughout. It was almost as if Kurosawa was letting the meter wind away in the background. So there was a sense of rhythm throughout that was sort of the omitted poetry. And also what you have here is the play or the plot reduced to mythical rhythm rather than you know, reproduced in detail, and with some very interesting elisions. You know, for example, the spouses becoming very different characters from Goneril and Regan, and then the mixture between Edmund and Kent, it would be, no, Gloucester, beg your pardon, and then the blinding being transposed to Sue's brother, or Sue's brother, Sue's brother. So there was that kind of transposition, which is perfectly allowable.
Yeah, I mean, he basically cuts the subplot that Shakespeare introduced into the story, or grafted into the story, to take a better analogy. He gets rid of that in the interest of economy, but then he finds use for elements of this subplot from King Lear of Edmund and Edgar and their father Gloucester, which kind of mirrors the main plot and then intersects with it. But he uses elements from it and says, well, that's good. I need to have a blind person somehow in this heath. That's good. That works in Shakespeare. But here it becomes very interesting because it's a previous victim of the Lear character.
Yes. And
this is what Kurosawa was very keen to do, is to provide some kind of backstory. And it's a horrendous backstory. When, you know, Shakespeare is famously quite silent sometimes about his lead protagonist's backstories. You know, Lear says very little about his wife, for example, who's absent. Lear says very little about what he did before he started this play, right? But in Kurosawa, we keep on getting these hideous revelations of what the Lear character has done to previous generations and actually future generations. He's effectively blinded this kid. He's spared his life, but he's gouged his eyes out. And this kid will come as a figure of nemesis and haunt him in his madness. And the hauntings are very powerful in this film. But again, that's Kurosawa with a kind of magpie eye, just like Shakespeare, that magpie eye thinking, I can use that image of the blind confronting the mad that otherwise I'm cutting out of the play.
He's much less sympathetic, Lear, isn't he, in this version?
Well, I would say it depends also on the production, because there are some Shakespeare adaptations where King Lear is very unlikable. It's the famous film from the 60s, which is
Peter Brook,
is it? Yes. Which has him as very tyrannical. So it is possible to see him that way, and it's interesting that Kurosawa has gone down that route, and presumably using this character from Japanese legend as well, but bringing in Lear. I wanted to ask you, because you were talking about the rhythm and the plot that you felt in this film, you could sense the rhythm there, and I wanted to think a little bit about what makes this still Shakespeare somehow. even though it's been adapted and changed and plotted so much and added so much backstory to the story and different elements, is it that rhythm that you describe? Is it the plot and the storyline that keeps it Shakespeare, or is it not Shakespearean? Is that okay?
Can we have a vote on that?
Yeah. What do we think? Shakespeare or not Shakespeare?
There's a lot of ink spilt about this in the Academy, about the various gradations and various taxonomies of adaptation. You know, from offshoot, what is an offshoot, what is an adaptation, what is a so-called tradaptation, and so on and so forth. What's pastiche and so on. And it really worries some people whether we can call something Shakespearean or not Shakespearean, because there are various cultural politics surrounding that. There is the authority of Shakespeare's name. It doesn't bother me for a second, one way or the other, but I think it would be hard to say that this isn't Shakespeare.
Yeah, it's clearly
because the filmmaker is clearly engaging with King Lear, and Kurosawa was a little bit cute when he talked about how influential Lear was on this film. But clearly it is a conversation with another text, and it's forming a conversation between two texts, Lear and this new text that we've just seen.
It's interesting though. I mean, I wrote a new version of the Clytemnestra story, and wondered what the minimum had to be for it still to be about the house of Atreus. And I thought that Clytemnestra had to kill Agamemnon, and that Orestes had to then kill Clytemnestra. So, according to Kurosawa, what's the minimum requirement here? A fool and Lear. Lear has to go mad, and
he has to divide his kingdom.
And he has to lose the good son. So those are the four elements that I can see. Other than that, it's difficult, isn't it?
But then he takes on the whole theme and imagery of sight and seeing. And then there are moments when he's explicitly referencing the text, when the wonderful villainess, when she's pretending to be throwing that tantrum and crying because she wants her opposite number knocked off.
She's delicious,
and she
isn't
sees the bug, and she sees the bug under her kimono.
A moth,
I beg your pardon. And squashes it very dispassionately. And that's as flies to wanton boys and we to the gods, they kill us for their sport.
All in that one image.
Yeah, and so he's recycling that, and he's doing a wonderful new thing with it, and it's telling us everything about that character and that moment as well. But that's a Shakespearean allusion, at the very least.
On that point about you make Gwyneth at the beginning about the cuckoo image in the film, and of course it was also echoed in what the Fool says about the serpent's egg and the speckled egg of the bird and the serpent devouring the bird and so on. Does that imagery come anywhere from the play, from Lear? I wondered, not being as familiar with it as all of you are, or was that out of the Japanese tradition?
Well, it may well be also out of the Japanese tradition, but the Lear itself is full of references to eggs and serpents and adders and so on. So how sharper than a serpent's tooth it is to have an ungrateful child. The Fool uses the metaphor of an egg when he's talking about Lear giving away his crown and so on and so forth. So it is there. It is there in the original, whatever the original is, because after all, we're talking about a play, King Lear, that had two texts published in early modern England, but quite different.
On the issue of the cuckoo, which presumably in Kurosawa, it is, I think, the cuckoo in the nest, isn't it? The ungrateful or unnatural child that is a.
I don't recall it in Lear, but
there's a danger to their siblings, and I think does that.
Risk embarrassment, not off the top of my head.
No. Please write to us.
Okay. Answers on a postcard.
But it's interesting. Sorry, I don't want to cut your point short, but the Lear figure. To look at him, I was very aware at various points of a very theatrical makeup. Which was making you aware of him as playing the part of a mad old man. He was delineated in that way much more than the other characters, who were more kind of filmic. So there was some play with characters coming into two dimensions, and then back into 3 maybe.
Yeah.
Right. Shall I? Yeah, you've slightly preempted me in that I was about to open it up for 2 questions from the audience. So if anyone else wants to ask any questions or observations,
Yeah, it's the fool, isn't it? The cuckoo, something so long that it had its head bit off by its young.
Yes.
So yeah, there is a
Thank
cuckoo
you
in
very
it.
much.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I can't give the exact words.
No, absolutely right.
Top marks.
The fear of cuckoldry as well. You know, that's kind of somewhere in there, because Shakespeare makes that connection in other plays about cuckoo and cuckoldry and so on, and that's kicking around in the fear of your wife being unfaithful and seeing this production. But yeah.
do we have any questions, observations?
On the Shakespeare, not Shakespeare issue, I just wonder whether actually, I mean, obviously, there's no right answer, as you've already said, but the thing that for me makes Shakespeare is this idea that you can, as Peter Brooks says, explode every line into 1,000 atoms. Every line's like an atom, and it can be exploded in 1,000 ways or whatever. So, actually, is it more possible to be Shakespeare on film? I wonder, because you can show those pictures, whereas when you just try and translate it into another language, for example, or into any sort of word-based translation, you'll somehow reduce it. Whereas I think for me it's more possible to do that on film, because you are showing you can show many different pictures.
How did you feel? Yeah, when you were doing The Tempest, did you feel the pressure to do line by line, word by word, or
No.
did you feel it was freer than that?
It was freer than that, and almost, I think, perhaps one of the signs of a great artist in one medium is the fact that they are moving on to another medium already, and a medium that hasn't yet been invented. And in this case, it was the pop video almost in Shakespeare, because each metaphor is a sort of a video. And of course, I was translating words and stage directions, and not directing, which is another form of translation, and editorializing.
Yeah.
So.
Do you think? Well, no. Just kind of piggybacking on that. If you think about what translate means in the works of Shakespeare, it means one of 3 different things. One is to reform, metamorphose, change. The other is, as in, "O bottom, thou art translated," when bottom comes back with the ass's head. "O bottom, thou art translated," you've been changed overwhelmingly into something else. The other is about linguistic translation from one language to another. And the third refers to interpretation. So to translate something is to interpret something, not necessarily between one language and another, but to say what you think it means. So we get in Hamlet when just after Hamlet has killed Polonius and he's dragged him out, and Gertrude, Hamlet's mum, is left in the room alone, and she just makes these sounds. And Claudius, her husband, comes in and says, "There's matter in these sighs, these profound heaves. You must translate. 'Tis fit we understand them." So I think those 3 different versions of senses of the word translate and the activity are very helpful in thinking about the range of translations that occur in adaptations. So there's translation between different languages, as in the case we're talking about here, and partly here. There's also translation between different orders of semiotics. Now that sounds a bit sort of highfalutin, as it were, but what you're partly talking about is saying the change you make when you're going from a linguistic text to a filmic text produces all sorts of new possibilities. And that in itself is an act of translation that has its pros and cons, and has its detractors and supporters. But it is inevitably a sea change that Shakespeare's text undergoes in this kind of telling. Does that make sense? I mean, I hope that sort of makes sense.
Interesting that this was a French co-production as well. That surprised me. I would have liked to have known more about the history of the production.
I think it's primarily to do with money. And the fact that the French government was very good at giving subsidies to filmmakers in the 80s and into international filmmakers.
And it's interesting that you were talking about, Paul, that there's almost like this anxiety around changing or adapting or cutting Shakespeare.
Yeah.
in that it's seen as some kind of sacred text that we mustn't disturb. I know that you adapted a couple of Shakespeare plays for the Montana Shakespeare Company.
Yeah.
And how did you? What were the challenges there?
Well, I mean, I'd first say that you're absolutely right, that there is a kind of potentially a moral panic that emerges when you talk about cutting Shakespeare. Remember recently when Cumberbatch played Hamlet, and they decided to put the to be or not to be at the beginning of the production rather than roughly in the middle where it usually comes. And for some reason, people who usually don't seem to give much of a crap about Shakespeare suddenly got up in arms and were writing newspaper pieces about how this was, sacrilegious. Of course, it's not at all. That's absolutely absurd.
I
But
thought
it does.
was bad drama.
Well, that's that. You can argue that case, but
Yeah.
it's not sacrilege. And of course, the process of adapting Shakespeare goes back to Shakespeare's own time. This is one of the reasons why we have two very different versions of King Lear being published roughly in Shakespeare's lifetime, because he himself seems to have had second thoughts about the efficacy of his first draft. So the point is, the practice goes back to Shakespeare's time anyway, so these texts aren't sacred. It's very interesting, in America at the moment, there's a very large and important festival called the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, OSF, in Ashland, Oregon. And they are commissioning translations of Shakespeare into modern English. And this has created a kind of moral panic. And it's very interesting because we now understand that Shakespeare, it's fine to translate Shakespeare across languages, but in a sense the last taboo is translating Shakespeare into English. And that's really interesting, the kind of cultural buttons that pushes. Just briefly, going back to Montana, my work in Montana, I did there as an adapter what every adapter has to do. You get the given conditions of the performance. So in this case, this is a group of 10 actors who take a play on the road across 5 states for 2 months every summer to rural and underserved communities. The play has to be done in daylight, so you've got a 2-hour running time, and you've got to create it for 10 actors, got to play every part. So those are part of your conditions. Then culturally, you have the conditions of the audiences that you want to reach. So when you do something like The Taming of the Shrew, I think personally it's unacceptable to do, as it were, a straight reading of The Taming of the Shrew. By straight, I mean one that encourages men to beat their wives and generally supports patriarchy. I think that's an untenable position in 2016. So I have to change the text. I have to make it fit to say the thing I want it to say. Shakespeare can't do anything about it. I mean, we were celebrating his death yesterday in Stratford, and many people were trying to commune with him, but answer came there none, right? So Shakespeare can't do anything about it, and we can impose our own liberal or non-liberal attitudes onto him. But
can I ask one question?
Yeah.
You know, within the Oregon updating, are they keeping the iambic pentameter? Because I don't mind about the updating in the sense of adapting to a more easily comprehensible vocabulary, if you like, and syntax. But I would go to the barricades for the 5-beat line.
what about prose bits? Let them have it.
I mean, that's prose.
Well, they are. I have heard that they are trying to keep these translators to
You've
the
got to
rhythm.
do it. Not good
But
enough.
it's too difficult. That's why he's a genius.
It's not too
It's a
difficult.
tough- it's
It's
a tough game.
possible.
Okay.
It's an Australian poet called Marco Conrad's
I think we have time for one more question. So, to the keen gentleman.
Can I just ask Gwyneth, because on that point about translation into contemporary English, when you translate into Welsh, I presume that you are translating into a contemporary Welsh rather than some sort of attempt to recreate an Elizabethan Welsh, or am I wrong about that?
No,
What's the atmosphere you're looking for there?
you have to choose. I mean, and I went for a more accessible, because it seemed to me, why would you make it more difficult for audiences while keeping a standard, a kind of decorum within the plot? But no, I mean, I thought I would have to learn Elizabethan swear words in Welsh. In fact, I found a swearing dictionary, very contemporary. It exists on the web. It's a great resource. Some very original turns of phrase. But No, I didn't do it, but you could. I mean, what's the point? You could just go to some earlier translations if they existed. I mean, they probably don't in Welsh, but in other languages they would.
I know there are some Hamlets that won the Eisteddfod or something like that.
Years ago.
Years ago, some older translations.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's something, taking some cultural capital there, which is interesting. But yes, I think that is where we're going to bring it to a close. So I want to thank our two panellists, Gwyneth Lewis and Paul Prescott. And I'd also like to thank the British Council, Rebecca and Lauren from the British Council particularly, Stephen and Claire from Chapter and Chapter for having us in general, the BFI for making this screening series possible, and also you, the audience, for coming tonight. So thank you very much.
Shakespeare.
And Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Who's definitely remarkable.
We're not celebrating.
Yeah.
The author is dead.